There's something really nice about using something really simple like a pencil to draw. You can get in the creative flow, and there's just something very pure about being able to create an entire world, an infinity of imagination from a really, really simple thing. AI art is pretty much exactly the opposite of that, no matter which way you dice it and no matter which way you use it. Personally, I always wanted to draw from imagination. I come from that school of thought, and by that I mean no reference, no nothing, just me and a pencil. That's actually what I imagined everyone was doing. It's what I always aspired to do. It's why I put so much time into learning to draw things like comics and developing my own style, trying to really figure out how to just sit down and draw kind of anything I wanted. Although I did sort of start my career in development at the dawn of the digital art revolution, and I saw a lot of these different movements come in as I tried to develop my craft. People started using photos really heavily as reference, and then they started just photo bashing and just combining photos into the work. This was especially prevalent in concept art, which was an industry I was really interested in getting into. Learning to draw, and more importantly, to create pictures from our imagination to really sort of have something to say and be able to communicate it through a medium is immensely challenging. We have to learn a whole bunch of craft. We have to learn about ourselves, about our artistry. We have to integrate all these things, and we have to practice a huge amount. And I really think one of the things that makes this even harder is all this AI nonsense. Spending a lot of time worrying about it, thinking about it, commenting about it, and just kind of letting it fill your brain. This is not helpful. Recently, there has been another one of these little waves of AI controversy about how much you can actually integrate AI into your workflow, and is it good and isn't. I don't know. But I thought, look, I haven't made an AI video in a while, so what I want to do in this video is try and share with you a slightly different take, slightly different viewpoint that I don't see a lot of people really sort of addressing or taking in a lot of the drama. There are people out there who are pursuing this on a legal level, and they're doing a really good job of that, as are people who have sort of addressed the moral and the ethical issues involved with AI, and I think that's all really important. I agree with pretty much all of it. If AI were to just sort of disappear and go away, again, that would be just fine as far as I'm concerned. I guess where I can see my viewpoint being sort of a little bit different is that, I come from a background of wanting to, as I said, just draw with pencil. I'm not really interested in using 3D or all these sort of other technological things, but, I've developed a lot of my career in this sea of technological advancement. And right now, I'm actually probably more exposed to both sort of job threat from AI, and I'm sort of surrounded by people who are probably more pro AI than sort of most other artists out there. So yeah, anyway, hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of this topic actually has to do with illustration theory, illustration process, and I guess, one of the controversial issues is like, does AI have any place in sort of being a real artist, and actually creating real illustrations or whatever that means. Spoiler alert, I don't think there's a lot there. It seems like mostly it's just kind of sort of waste time. But if you want to sort of hear my thoughts in general on illustration theory and kind of some of the processes and tips that I've kind of learned over a 20-year career as a professional artist, you can check out my free illustration workshop. I talk a lot about how, I've thought about things like secondary form, how to get more detail and polish in your work, and sort of what role planning and thumbnails have in being able to get the idea from your head down onto the page. So again, if you're interested in that stuff and you want a little bit more background on like what I think about sort of a good illustration process might be, you can check that out. Link will be in the description. All right, so before we jump in, let me just preface this with, a little bit of background information, because I think who we are and where we're at, and sort of especially a lot of what our incentives are, how we make money as professionals, is really going to influence what we kind of think about these sort of LLMs and generative imagery. But also, I'd say I'm going to record this in a fairly sort of loose manner. I'm not going to try and edit this too much. So even more so for a drawing codex video, this is probably going to be not heavily edited and not fast paced. So apologies for that. But again, I just thought it would be good to kind of talk through some of these in a little bit more of a casual setting. So grab a sketchbook, do some drawing, do some good in the world. And yeah, I'll sort of share with you some of my thoughts on this, quote unquote AI stuff. Now, the first thing I kind of see about myself, and again, the reason I think this is so important is depending on where you are in your career, and depending on kind of really a lot of it comes down to like where you make your money, where the bottom line is, it's just drastically going to affect the things that you say and the things that you teach and your opinions. And I remember being, very early on in my career, and I remember, getting fired from a video game company sort of really early on. That's like a major part of my story. I remember getting fired and getting all sort of like teary, and people would say like, that's it for video games in Australia, like it's all over, and the industry kind of completely collapsed. And I was just like, that's it, my life is over. This is the end. And, it was really hard to know like what's true, what's not. The one of the TLDRs I'd sort of give you is like over the 25, 30 years that I've really been sitting here trying to be like, oh, what am I going to do? Probably again, more like sort of 25 years, going from high school to, being where I am now, is like people say a lot of nonsense, right? About like what is and what isn't going to happen. I remember after Lord of the Rings came out, people were saying, that's it. Hollywood's never going to make a blockbuster film again. They're never going to make money on it. That's it. It's only going to be sort of low budget things from now on. And then you get all these sort of Marvel films that like have way higher budgets. So like people say all sorts of stuff about like where the industry's going and where it's not. People are dooming, people are hyping, people are going crazy. One of my sort of, I guess, unhealthy passions is Silicon Valley hype cycles and the Silicon Valley sort of hustle culture and that whole thing. The whole thing is fascinating to me. I think people are going to write books about all the nonsense that's happening right now, about sort of psychology and human greed and human stupidity. And it's going to be super fascinating. But you can kind of look at it in real time. It's just one of the most fascinating things for me. And, so I've sort of noticed a lot of these things happening. I'd say like the bottom line is it's really hard to know what's going to happen. I've seen people say all sorts of nonsense about what isn't going to happen in terms of technology. Yeah, all this kind of stuff. So, it is really challenging. But I will say that, again, as a bit of background on me, I've been a professional comic book artist. I've done sort of professional illustration. I've worked for sort of video games as a concept artist. I've worked in sort of feature animation as a concept artist. I've worked on pitch work for sort of animated TV shows. Like I've done a whole bunch of stuff, right? And most of it just using very simple processes, right? That are almost identical to like, let's just, get some pencil and paper and some markers and watercolor, right? That's mostly what I do. So, I have seen a lot of the technology evolve. I started out using Photoshop really early on, and people would say, you're just pressing this button and then you're getting all these lens flares and all this art. It was really, people really viewed digital art as like terrible and you're not a real artist. So, and the same for photo bashing and 3D and all that kind of stuff. I'll get into a little bit of that in so the first point I want to make. But yeah, I've seen a whole bunch of people say a whole bunch of stuff. I think it's so important to understand that who's saying the things is very much based on their reality. And like, for instance, if you're a working illustrator, if you're an artist who's like, your entire income and everything you do is just based around like you making art and understanding how to make it more efficiently, how to get better at it, how to get better at dealing with clients, all of this stuff, like that is literally your life. That's kind of where I'm at. Like most of my sort of income, like most of what I do comes from me being an artist. And, for the most of my career, that's exactly what's happened. I'm not a full-time YouTuber. I'm a full-time artist. I work in video games. I've done a whole bunch of different sort of full-time art over the years. Sometimes I've made no money. Sometimes I've made, like decent money at it. But I think, as you separate yourself from that world, the realities of being an artist for the full time, I think it becomes harder to see that. You see people kind of, getting separated from the fact that you a big part of being an illustrator is doing a thumbnail, right? Like if you can't make your finished image look exactly like your thumbnail, like it's really hard to make it as an illustrator. Like, that's just such an obvious thing. But, again, if you've never really worked in those industries, if you've never really done that, it's easy to kind of, just kind of have this weird view of being an artist and, just be very kind of separated from it. And again, that's a valid sort of point of view to have, but you just got to understand, like, people are coming from all sorts of different perspectives, and, you have to weight what they're saying with what they're actually doing. And that's just so important. And I would imagine, if I kind of separated myself from that, it would be very easy to kind of just not be quite as connected with the realities of how production is actually going. And I think, the more you get involved and understand what it actually takes to make a video game or a movie, what it takes to write a story, the more you kind of understand how complicated it is and how pathetic and lacking a lot of the AI output that is actually meant to sort of replace us is. Although, what I will say is, probably more than most artists, I am both exposed to a lot of AI from a career sort of danger point of view. I'm sort of surrounded by people who are probably more pro AI than most. And, I also sort of use it more than most people. So again, I think people have done a really good job of looking at the ethical, the legal side of it. I agree with all of that. I guess my sort of approach is a bit more like, I got really worried about this stuff because you'd see all these people posting videos about like, hey, I just pressed a button and all of a sudden I got like a fully rigged video game character and, illustrations over. And I think like the more I actually was like, okay, let me try that. Let me actually go and look at it. And again, my sort of, I guess, point of view on that is this way I can present better opinions to people who are in my community, people who are learning from me, etc. I actually wanted to go and see how to use it and see what the reality of it is. So that's kind of my perspective, is less on the ethical, less on the legal side, or I think that's super valid, and more on just like, what can it do? Is it actually useful? Is it ever going to replace anyone? Is it any good? Or is it just a huge waste of time, right? Is it just fully 100% Silicon Valley hype cycle? Is it going to go nowhere? Like, what's actually going to happen? So in order to do that, I think you have to use it. I've used it quite a bit. And I'm also, because I sort of teach courses and I use a lot of sort of different SaaS software to do that, people are in SaaS, like software as a service, like Adobe, sort of like Notion. Even a lot of the course platforms are really fully into AI. They're like, oh, we can generate a whole course for you with AI. And it's like, you try it and it's terrible, right? I use it for a variety of things. I'm always playing around with it. And whenever I see some, sort of AI bro guy make a video and be like, oh, you can easily do this and do that, I look into it and I try and figure out like how and what is going on. And, if ever I actually think about like, okay, do I think that AI could actually do this and make my life easier in some way? I often go try it. And I'd say in 100% of the cases, I've just been like, this doesn't work. This is not helping me. It's not doing what I imagine it's going to do. The output, if I compare it to me actually just doing it myself, is always just like so woefully inadequate. And again, I think that's also part of the perspective that you might get depending on where you are. Like, I can make the illustrations, I can write the stories. I've written and illustrated entire comics by myself without any assistance, right? Without any, I did a lot of it by hand, right? Just sort of typing, or sort of writing notes. And, when you can do that, when you don't need a lot of these aids and tools, you see how limiting they are and how pathetic they are. And that's a major difference in how you're going to view things, right? If you're constantly looking for like reference to draw anatomy, if you're constantly sort of, not having a decent process for your illustration and you're kind of just struggling all the time, then like having some guiding light of like, oh, okay, I can just make an AI image to kind of help me, or, oh, this thing can write my story for me, or like, oh, I can't be bothered doing research, or I don't know how to do research. So like, this thing does it for me, and like it does it instantly. It's really good. The problem is it mostly does a really bad job of it. It's terrible. And if you aspired to be a terrible writer or a terrible artist or someone who's very formulaic or sort of generic, and, the images you're creating don't say a lot because they're all geared towards some kind of mythical sort of pinnacle of like what will make your eyes bleed, you're in trouble, right? But, I just don't think it's that good. Anyway, and I don't see any future where it's going to get sort of really good in some exponential curve. That's me personally. So, and I think a lot of that is based around actually being on the front lines I would say the company I work for is full of super interesting people, highly intelligent, highly talented people, but it is a super tech forward company. The company I work for is essentially one of the last vestiges of the Web3 sort of blockchain technologies. And, we're still building a blockchain game, right? What I do on it is I help create the story and the lore and actually create, using very old school processes, a comic book, which is a prequel to the story. So that's kind of my role. But I'm talking to people who are fully on board the AI train and they're super passionate and interested in it. People who are developers, coders. And, basically, if AI could do my job, I would probably get fired, right? I'm sort of on the tip of the spear there. So again, and I know that's, a lot of people have sort of lost their jobs due to AI. It's very hard to know why a lot of that stuff is happening. We're in a very particular rocky sort of economic situation, political situation. The free money era is over. There's a lot of stuff that's kind of changing. It's really hard to find causality in a lot of these things. And I know that's sort of a massive challenge. And again, I'm not trying to go there too much, but that is just problematic, right? People are, it is a reality that some people are probably going to lose their jobs depending on what they're doing. But I'm saying, like, from someone who has a fully developed career, I'm one of these people where probably, like, to me, I always feel like tomorrow it could all be over, right? And I'd have to go find some other job. And other people, probably most people who would view my career are like, oh, you're fully established, like, you don't have to worry. Where I am right now, if AI could do my job in any way, shape, or form, I would be gone, right? Like, that's as far as I'm concerned, that's kind of where it is. So again, that's a little bit about me. Apologies for, again, not being quite so concise here. But I just want to share with you, a little bit about sort of my background so you can understand where I'm coming from. I think this is at the crux of a lot of these sort of confusion and the FUD and all of that kind of stuff that's out there, is you really have to understand what people are actually doing. Are you a full-time YouTuber? Are you actually working professionally? Which industry are you working in? How exposed is it to AI? Where are you in your career? How formulaic was your art to begin with? Like, what were you trying to do? It's really tricky. And again, it's always been tricky to be an artist, to have any one of these sort of creative jobs. It's probably, one of the least kind of stable careers you can have. But, it is what it is. And, I've sort of managed to survive it over the years. And this is where I am right now. Okay, so with that out of the way, the first issue, I guess, the first idea that really sort of comes up for me is, can we as artists utilize or sort of incorporate AI in some way, shape, or form into our process? Like, is it going to make us better? Is it just another one of these tools like 3D, photo bashing, whatever it is, like all these sort of digital things, like digital art itself? Is it just another evolution, and are we sort of being Luddites to sort of, resist it or complain about it or whatever? Again, I think that's sort of an interesting sort of point of view. And, it's important to understand, again, from my perspective, I come from a fairly puritanical, especially these days, view of like what we should be trying to do as artists. And this is not something I'm trying to defend or justify. I'm just saying, like, this is kind of where I come from. I grew up wanting to be a comic book artist, and that was, I just sort of thought people didn't use reference, right? I was like, I'd see people like Jack Kirby or like Hergé creating Tintin, and Tintin and Hergé used a lot of photographic reference. Like, I now understand a lot of people use a lot of photographic reference, and often, wherever they can, people often use assistants, right? Like the ethical idea of like you just being this pure artist, where you just do everything and there's no, it's just 100% from your imagination. Like, that's a little bit Pollyanna, right? It might be a little bit unrealistic. And, I sort of understand the realities of how a lot of that stuff is created. As also, I sort of had to embrace a lot of those technological tools like 3D for all sorts of reasons. And I've sort of worked in video games where I have, sort of incorporated 3D as blockouts as part of the design process, both for sort of ships, environments, characters, all sorts of things. I've also gotten to the point where like, okay, we can like build an entire environment in 3D in Blender, and we're going to render that, and we're going to use, the lighting and the materials and the surfacing and all that stuff as like a major way to kind of get 90% of the way to finished painting. So I've sort of played around with a lot of this stuff. I don't view myself as being sort of a Luddite, but funnily enough, again, like still my view of like what drawing is like pencil and paper, no nothing, right? Like no I don't know why that is the case, but there's just a purity to that that's always sort of appealed to me. And also it's really fun. It's really fun to just be able to draw stuff. Like, again, this is me sharing like my experience of drawing is that it's really fun to just not have to worry about looking at reference. My anatomy is not the best, but I can do illustrations and I can draw the things that I kind of want because I studied anatomy a lot. And, I built my entire process, and a lot of my teaching process is based around like building visual library, not building reference, and understanding perspective and form drawing and construction and having multiple stages in an illustration process, developing your thumbnailing, and that we have these creative ways that we can sort of build up and construct things. And that, like, yes, you need to understand how the world works, but you don't always need to be looking at reference as you're drawing. And again, that's just me. That's just sort of my approach. That's what I kind of actually like doing. The feeling of just having a blank page and knowing I had the tools to make that into something really fun and interesting. That's what gets me excited about art. Building it all out in Blender and sort of assigning materials and stuff kind of, it's not that fun for me, right? It's a challenge. It's sort of interesting, but if I never have to do that again, I'm fine. If I can't draw it with a pencil and paper ever again, then I'll be very, very, very unhappy. But I guess the key thing here is that we have seen a lot of art and a lot of artists be assisted by technology over the years. The classic thing is your camera obscura, where, I think a lot of people had this idea that, these old masters could all draw really well, and there must be some cheat to it, some trick. And I think there was some documentary where someone sort of recreated some, famous sort of old master painting and was like, oh, they're using the camera obscura, and, they're just sort of tracing it and all this kind of stuff. And, the reality is like, yeah, some people probably did that. Some people probably also were just really good at drawing and painting. Like there is this inability for a lot of people to just accept that like you can just paint and figure it all out yourself, right? But people have always used references, life drawing, like using live models as part of the process. As soon as people could, they used a lot of photo reference. And I think, this again is something I have no interest in, but it certainly is something that has allowed people to create particular looks. Like sort of one of my favorite artists that I'm often sharing is like Robert McGuinness, who created a lot of sort of the James Bond covers, just a huge variety, like hugely prolific artist. And, I think a big part of his process was actually just projecting photos and kind of, basically tracing them onto canvases and stuff. Again, like I don't know exactly how his process worked, but, this has been a major part of how everyone has done stuff. People trace things. And also, again, looking at modern concept art, I always like to use this as an example. I feel like there's a good sort of video in here that I haven't made yet, but, if you look at like Star Wars, if you look at like the original Ralph McQuarrie art for Star Wars, like A New Hope, the original trilogy, it's all done in, sort of traditional painting, traditional medium. Looks really good. It still works today, right? You can open those books and it's like, wow, this is amazing. And then you sort of look at the episode 1, sort of art book from, sort of late 90s, and it's mostly traditional. And, again, I still think that's one of the best art books out there. And then you can kind of look at like the concept art for something like, sort of Rogue One, or The Mandalorian or whatever. It actually has a lot of the same people working on it, but it's much more 3D. It's much more photo bashing. It's much more sort of practical, right? That there's less painting. It's kind of less of the sort of art that I thought I really wanted to do as a concept artist. And technology has drastically changed the way we do art. A lot of illustrators these days are basically building all their figures in Dash 3D, and then they're sort of importing it into Blender. They're putting skin shaders on it. They're simulating all the cloth. Building castles in the background. Like rendering it all out and kind of doing just sort of touch-ups in the end, and making it feel a bit more sort of stylized or whatever. And I think the problem that I've always said that you need to watch out for, because one of the things, again, the other thing I've sort of done that maybe I sort of didn't mention is, I spent a lot of time, maybe sort of 10 years of my life was spent with the concept design workshop in Adelaide, Australia. And that sort of was a place where we were sort of teaching people how to do concept art, how to do illustration, comics, etc. And it quickly became part of like a university or college degree. And we'd have like hundreds of people come through every year. And, you'd see people developing different styles for different things, different industries. People got into VFX, animation. It got quite big. And, a lot of what I would obsess over is stepping people through these kind of career options and kind of trying to help them build processes and figure out what their style was and stuff. And, the number one thing I'd kind of say to everyone is like, a lot of these crutches, like using 3D, again, using DAZ 3D as a base for your sort of characters, is like, that's good, but you're really formulating your art. You're really making it into this commodified thing where your ability for your style or your personality to come through across all of those different technological crutches you're using is much harder. It's much harder for you to be unique and stand out in the marketplace. And I think, a lot of what you're kind of seeing is like that is kind of happening, right? There is a commodification of sort of art in general, where a lot of people are using the same tools, same styles, and you get this kind of stuff where like one artist's work is very similar to another artist's work, and we're kind of being pushed there, again, in a lot of video game industries and a lot of things where, like, yeah, if you're all kind of aiming for one sort of generic look, one generic sort of concept art process, it's very easy to get replaced, right? Like, this is a dangerous place to be. And I've always tried to move away from that and try and say, yes, I'm going to be a concept artist, but I'm going to try and develop a style that's kind of unique and combine the fact that I just happened to work in French comics for 10 years and, build this sort of different career that where like what I'm doing looks a little bit more different to what everyone's doing. And I think like, obviously that's something that we should all try and do. It is try and be a little bit more unique. And, that from a career perspective is probably going to be a better idea. But people have been really moving towards this commodified art style, commodified art processes, especially in concept art and entertainment design. And there's just a huge amount of danger there, right? And I think often when you see a lot of sort of AI come along, it does kind of just replace a lot of these very commodified, generic looking illustrations that don't have a lot of personality in them, that kind of aren't really doing anything different. But, we've kind of been pushed into making art this way. So that to me has been something where I've kind of been saying to people, like, don't go there. It's not a great place to be just making art that looks exactly the same as everyone else's, using exactly the same processes and using a huge amount of automation in the process where, you're using a lot of 3D, a lot of sort of rendering from sort of real-time rendering engines. So, a lot of the rendering looks the same. And people are then using kit bash parts, and it's like, it's not a good recipe, right, for creating original art and, building a career where, you're not easily replaceable. What I would say, though, the real interesting thing to me is like, yes, people have been using photos, every crutch they can find, like any way you can kind of create art easier or faster. People often do it. But if you look at a lot of these sort of traditional illustrators, right, this is often the argument is like, oh, AI is just like using reference, or it's just like doing this. If you look at the processes that a lot of old illustrators had, like people using very different styles would still use photo reference, right? Like the Hildebrandt brothers, like Tim Hildebrandt, like amazing sort of fantasy artist, created Lord of the Ring sort of calendar illustrations and a whole bunch of other stuff, like super colorful, stylized, but very realistic looks. They used heaps of photo reference, but their art is very unique. It's very, very specifically Hildebrandt art. And I can see that style. Likewise, if you look at Robert McGuinness' example, who created all these kind of book cover illustrations, like, yes, he used a lot of photo reference. I think there's a big part of tracing photos. But the surface of the painting is uniquely Robert McGuinness. It has a very distinct style. And you can see that there's a couple of things that happen. Is that firstly, the sort of reference, the sort of crutches are a very specific part of a process. And they are helping the artist to get a particular look, to make it look realistic in a particular way, to get a particular type of thing to happen. And not everyone uses photo reference. Not everyone uses all of these crutches. Sometimes you don't want to do that, right? Sometimes you want things to be more exaggerated, more cartoony. Likewise, like a lot of traditional Disney animation was essentially rotoscoped. It was like very closely, you can see it was very closely based on reference of people from movies and things. Again, this has been a part of it, but it's always the fact that like the finished Disney film doesn't look like the photo, right? It's something unique. They're really trying to build something that is unique and interesting. And I think the best illustrators do this. They have a really distinct process and they use particular crutches, but they get used to using it in a very particular systematic way. And they understand sort of where it helps them and where it doesn't. And you can see when you look at people who are really good at like literally they will shoot photo reference exactly the way they need it, and then they will trace it to create a finished painting, a traditional painting. This is how a lot of illustrators worked. Andrew Loomis from the Figure Drawing for All It's Worth and Creative Illustration talks about this, right? It's like, yeah, you're going to shoot reference. You can see where they're plussing the reference, right? You can look at your classic Norman Rockwell's, your J.C. Leyendeckers who used reference. They always made it better. Right? They made it better than the reference. They plussed it. And to the point where, like, again, a lesser artist wouldn't be able to get what they got out of the reference. They were always able to make it better. And you can see that, right? So many artists use photo reference and live models. It's a major thing. But the good ones made it better. They made it more fantastical, more interesting. They added more depth, more clarity. Again, photos aren't always the best thing. Sometimes they're wrong, right? Sometimes you're better off reposing the character for clarity and emotion and mood, and good artists know how to do that. If you're just kind of photo bashing a whole bunch of stuff, if you're just kind of 3D mocking things up, often, again, people don't have that same discipline. The other thing that's so important to understand is, I would say 100% of those people who used those processes and had a lot of tracing or photo bashing, or photo reference, or whatever you want to call it, they had thumbnails. And this is just a major part that a lot of people are kind of missing, is like, you need to have an idea in your head from a process standpoint. And yes, there may be things that you're using along the way, but you need to start with an idea and you need to be able to execute on that idea. And I think this is even important if you're just working by yourself. It's super critical if you're working professionally. But just planning the image, you can see this going back to the old masters. People planned their images. They did little sketches. They figured it out. They got reference. They got more reference. They got more models to refine all the details. But it starts with the thumbnail, with the idea, with what I'm creating. And if we kind of miss that creative process, it's so easy for the tail to wag the dog, to be using 3D as a base, or using, again, sort of 3D mock-ups and stuff. And I think a lot of what happens is people let the tools make a lot of the decisions. So it's less a matter of, having the thumbnail and then figuring out like, okay, now I have the really hard job of making my tools do what was my creative vision. Often what happens, I think, is people kind of mock a bunch of stuff up and then they're just sort of zooming around in Blender and they're kind of like taking photos of this thing. And there's not that creative intention, and they're not often dealing with the challenges that come from having to sort of realize a vision that you sort of created early on. Now, again, there's lots of different processes. Some people really like working in different ways, but I think that that's a major aspect where you have to be sure that the tail is not wagging the dog, that these crutches you're using, 3D, photo bashing, they're not making the decisions. Because otherwise, you're not really doing hard work. And if you're not really sitting there struggling and making creative decisions and having to be creative, then what you find is you're not really living the artistic, creative life. You're kind of letting these things do the work for you. And that works early on when you're ahead of the curve and you know how to use these tools and other people don't. But soon there's hundreds, thousands of other people who can do exactly the same thing. And the more you lean on those crutches, especially for the finished look, the more you're just kind of being obsolete. And it's just all that's happened is you've created a process that's so easy to use that now 100,000 other people who are far less skilled than you can just go along and copy and use it. And so I think this is a really challenging issue. And I think you have to look at like, not like, oh, what is possible and like this can help me and like this makes it easier, but look more at like, what are you doing as an artist? Like, who are you trying to be? Like, what are you trying to do? And how can you use a lot of these tools to really create something unique and interesting? And again, I think that if you look at sort of the limitations that AI often has in actually getting a very specific result, I haven't seen any situation where I think it's actually going to be useful in that way. I think looking at, the traditional processes that people had where you do a sketch and the sketch looks pretty good, and then you actually shoot the photo reference based on the sketch, and then you use the photo reference for your finish, like that seems the most reliable way to actually come up with an idea and sort of create something that's very close to that. And there's probably a lot of other ways, 3D and photo bashing and that kind of stuff can kind of help us with that. But again, I think the real danger is people letting the tail wag the dog. You let these tools define both sort of the compositions, like what is possible, what is easy, and also a lot of the finished look. Like you're losing yourself in the tool. And I think that's just like no way you want to be. You want to be as far away from that as humanly possible. The last thing I would say is that as part of sort of running workshops and being part of like a fairly large entertainment design school, I actually got to meet and see and sit into workshops for a lot of like really, really talented artists, people who are much, much better than me, and had really sort of high level careers working, at the top of all the video game companies and stuff. They come to Adelaide, Australia, they do workshops, and I get to see the process, right? And often the process, and they'd show their process. And I'd be like always surprised by how like even artists who, you'd sort of see their process, and then it'd be like, oh, and also I have this little thumbnail sketch that I did in a sketchbook. And you kind of find out that every single image they've ever done is based on a little thumbnail in a traditional sketchbook, even though you never actually see it, right? They don't show that as part of the process, but it's actually part of their creative process. They just don't show it because the little thumbnail is awful, right? It just looks ugly. And also, even when you look at artists who I think have gotten really good results and kind of kicked off a lot of this, let's use 3D, let's build like the majority of the image in 3D, let's reuse the lighting, all this stuff. You'd be surprised the degree to which they are creating all of that in the thumbnail. And that is, I think, why a lot of the images look really good and have that kind of high-end look. Is it's not just kind of throwing a whole bunch of stuff together. It's like, here's the vision, and now I'm going to use my process to build that. And I'd say in almost all cases, you see like a really solid reliance on a very sort of linear technical process. And also always the thumbnail is like a major, major part of the vision and what they're trying to do. And they will try and figure out how to realize that vision. Yes, it changes. Yes, you have happy accidents. Yes, you can modify things. That's often where a lot of the fun is. But again, you'd be surprised the degree to where for most really good illustrations, most really good concept art and stuff, that there's often a really nice little thumbnail that kind of leads the way. So a lot of, I guess, the actual controversy here that really surrounds like, can you use AI as part of a real sort of artist's creative process? And if so, sort of what does that look like and where are the lines? I guess there's probably a variety of different sort of facets to this. One would be the moral or the ethical, legal side of it, which again, I'm not really sort of talking about. I think other people have made very good cases for that. Other people are pursuing that. And for the most part, I'd sort of agree. I'd be like, yeah, probably you can't use that ethically or morally if you're sort of trying to really, sort of stand up for artist rights and make that sort of moral argument. I'm much more interested in like the practical side of it. Like, does it actually help you? Like, is it actually any good? And yeah, a lot of this will seem maybe like a little bit sort of salty or a little bit harsh. And again, normally I don't sort of go there. So let me know whether this kind of sounds harsh or how this lands. But again, the reason I kind of talk about a lot of the teaching experience I've had is that, I see a lot of different students come from a lot of different sort of perspectives. And I've sort of seen I've seen like every opinion you can have on this, every sort of place that people get locked in from a process standpoint, or where they're just not going to commit to the foundation. I've kind of seen it all. I've seen people lie to my face that they drew this thing without reference. And I'm like, I can tell you traced it, right? Like we could probably Google and find the photo you used. I've had people, sort of be having to draw a vehicle as part of sort of their final assignment that often we have like 6 months. This is a major assignment. Draw the whole car, and render it all from scratch. And we show the whole process, and we're doing this like every week. We're doing sort of feedbacks, and some people just try and use 3D. They're just gonna trace it. And like to my face, I'm like, so how'd you do that? And they're like, I drew it. And then I've had people say like, can I just use 3D to do this? And it's like, no, you can't. Like, it's interesting, like the number of different ways that people try and wriggle out of learning the foundations, I guess. And that's why I sort of point that. And again, depending on where you're at, right? If you're like, not a professional artist and you're not a professional illustrator, you can see someone, and I think again, like the video that kind of sparked a lot of this was a particular artist kind of showing their sort of process for creating an illustration. And it was just like simple figurative female illustration with some sort of flowy hair. Really sort of cool image. I like that artist's work. I like the sort of YouTube stuff they do. But yeah, if you're not an experienced sort of artist and you kind of look at that, again, that may seem sort of fairly standard, right? I think a lot of people do rely on reference in various ways. But what I see, again, based on my understanding of like where people are at, and I see a lot of like just not having a very solid process, right? Not having a foundational process to use, not using a thumbnail, not having a proper illustrative, step-by-step way to do things. Not really understanding why you would need that in the first place, and subsequently also not really committing to the foundational stuff, right? That's kind of what I see. Again, that may feel like sort of super harsh, but that to me is just really clear when I sort of see that, is there's a serious lack of committing to the foundation. And a lot of students I've sort of tutored and had to be exactly the same. And a lot of students can be really good. They can actually come in with really good skills, like, I can make this, but it's tricky to translate that to now you actually want to become a professional artist, because they often have to unlearn a lot of stuff and figure out how to work professionally and also commit to these foundational things. If you have a process that's very much based on like constantly looking for reference, I can see that AI might feel really sort of enticing. But also, in this case, this is a style that's very stylized, right? Often there's referencing artists who don't use reference, right? So it's like, it's a weird thing where it's like you're kind of doing art in a way that's not really following how the artists that you're kind of you're following and admire actually create their art. I think it's so important to actually look at the artists who you really want to be like. Look at how they actually make their art. Like, do they use 3D? Like, do they use reference? Like, how do they do it? And yeah, a lot of people just get stuck there where they're just not really going to commit to the foundation. And this is completely separate from what they say. But just what is actually happening is just not committing to those foundational things, not practicing and doing all the foundational exercises that you would typically do to improve your perspective, rendering, form drawing, understand anatomy, composition, illustration theory, illustration process, and to find something that really works for you and develop your own style and way of making things. Everyone's got their own process. Everyone's got their own sort of way of making it. But again, what I see when I look at that video is that, you probably would be really interested in how AI can help you. Because I think it seemed like there's a lot of struggle there, right? This image was taking a huge amount of time, like an ungodly amount of time for sort of what it was. Be very hard to, as a professional illustrator who's like trying to actually get jobs to make money, spending that much time on that level of complexity of image, as an example. Again, that's completely, your results may vary, but that would be my experience. To me, what I see is just not really doubling down on having a simple process, simple way of making images. And I think if you're really struggling with foundational things, like kind of how to draw hair, how to create dimension, how to, understand perspective, like if you're always using the crutches, if you're always using reference to find the pose and you can't really figure out how to modify it yourself, then your process is about finding better reference, right? And again, AI may be really good for that. But again, the elephant in the room is just that, like, probably also what would solve this is doubling down on foundation, understanding dimensionality, like building your visual library for how to draw particular things like anatomy poses and, these things. It's like a lot of this work is very female figurative art, right? There's not a lot of visual library you actually need for a lot of that. So it'd be pretty easy to sort of build that. And again, a lot of the sort of aspirational art that is trying to be created is very much similar to artists who often don't use a lot of reference, right? Are just kind of building those figures themselves, building those facial structures and all that kind of stuff. It's not realistic. It's not based on reference. The lighting is not realistic. The lighting is not really, adhering to realistic lighting. So it seems like a style and a process that would be much better suited to, sort of learning foundational comic book style anatomy, and just being able to sort of build a very sort of simple figure, and that would actually probably give you a lot more creative freedom in that instance. So that's really what I see there, and I think this is often the trap that a lot of people get into. I see a lot of students get stuck in this mud and they can't get out, which is like, instead of going through the fire and learning to draw properly, and again, by properly, I just mean like you can draw perspective stuff pretty easily. You understand rendering. You can make stuff look dimensional. You understand how to break down visual library. You have a process, right? Again, there's many different valid types of art. Not all of it is realistic or form-based. A lot of my favorite artists have very naive styles. A lot of my favorite comic book artists have very simple styles. But, a lot of people just refuse to actually learn the fundamentals. They refuse to learn to draw. And they just end up using a lot of these different sort of crutches, like 3D, like reference. I'm using this, I'm using that, and sort of Frankensteining reference and always trying to find stuff. And yeah, I think if you're in that case, you're going to really think like AI is great. And, maybe it's a big creative thing because you can solve this problem. That's what I see. And, what I would see if I was using AI is like, and I have tried this for various things. I've been like, I wonder whether AI would help. Again, I've sort of never used Midjourney. I've never been that sort of into it, but there's lots of ways you can kind of, through ChatGPT and different sort of things, you can get it to create images with it. So I'm probably not doing a very good job of it, but it's super boring. I sort of hate doing it. It's like so miserable to be typing and trying to get an image. But yeah, I think every time I've tried to do this, you just see like, this would be so much easier if I just drew it. Like, I know how to draw this better than this. And I think the result that was gotten in that video is very indicative of AI, which is like, it's not really what you wanted. It doesn't really help you that much. The reference in general, just finding different bits of reference is like not a very effective, efficient way to make art. It makes it very hard to kind of exactly get the pose you want and kind of say the things exactly that you want. Like that to me is just like the biggest sort of elephant in the room is like why is this even happening in the first place? And every experience I've had with trying to use AI in any way, shape or form in my creative process has just been that like, this is a huge, huge, huge waste of time. It would just be so much easier if I drew it. In most cases, that's just kind of what I end up doing. And I think this is the delta you see between if you have a solid foundation, if you kind of know what you're doing, if you have a process, if you practiced a lot, you're committed to the actual process of being an artist. What you'll find is like AI is just pretty useless because you see it just gives you these generic results and it's really hard to actually utilize it in any real way, shape or form. And the solution is always just draw better, understand dimensionality better, practice more, iterate more, right? Do 10 images, do 20 images in that time. Going through the process and stepping through it and understanding how to get dimensionality, doing more thumbnail sketches, thinking through the problem more, like what actually is going to create the effect you want, is going to actually build a muscle that will mean the next time you go to draw that, you can just draw it and it's easy and it's done. As opposed to next time just trying to have to, squeeze blood from a stone with all these different sort of methodologies and this sort of frenetic, crazy way of sort of creating what is a very simple image in a very sort of simplified style that is often built off the backs of artists who are probably, just sort of drawing it from imagination because it's very sort of stylized, basic figurative stuff. So again, that's probably like pretty harsh. But I think it's just so important to understand that because if you're involved in that drama, or if you're thinking like, oh, hey, is this going to help or is that going to help? It'll all help. Every crutch will help, right? Being able to use 3D can be super useful in some ways. I often use 3D as a base in some of my comics to get the spaceships right. Because again, my spaceship drawing is not as good as it could be, but I sort of realize where that starts and stops. And again, the other thing that's really important to understand about using any of these crutches is like a lot of people and a lot of students will think, oh, I just need to model this in 3D and then I can just draw over it and sort of add details. And what you'll find is that's really, really freaking hard. That's really hard. And most of the time when people see someone else doing that, the thing that will make the difference between you being able to utilize 3D in your process or utilize a reference in your process is like, if you kind of didn't need to use it and you are using the 3D just to make it a little bit faster, a little bit quicker, a little bit easier. And the same thing with the sort of anatomy reference, the photographic reference. Like if you're just using it to get the lighting a little bit more accurate or a little bit better, that's when you're really going to see the benefits, both in speed and efficiency. And that really is the difference. Is like if you're using 3D as a base because you couldn't draw that without it, that's when you're probably going to find the results are going to really be challenging, and you're going to be relying on that so much. If you're using it more for speed and efficiency, that's when probably, like people aren't going to notice or care that you've used it, and it's not really going to matter as much. Anyway, that's been my experience at the very least. The other narrative that I think I see a lot of people talk about when it comes to AI, and this is especially the case when you sort of look at like the AI bro, like pro AI art sort of thing, where they're like, well, we're just directors. I'm just a director. It doesn't really matter how I'm doing this. I've just got this sort of vision in my head. Okay. But the problem with a lot of AI is it doesn't actually get very close to the image you have in your head. If you have no idea in your head, or you're not an artist, you're not an experienced auteur, and you haven't really gone through the process of figuring out how to actually get an idea from your head onto the page, often what happens is people have a super vague idea, and then they sort of press the button or type the thing, and they get this image, and they're like, oh, that's really good. That is what I was thinking. And it's like, no, that's what the AI was thinking. That's what the LLM was thinking. That's what the generative algorithm was thinking. You weren't thinking that. You were just thinking something similar, and you do like that. And it's very easy to make that jump. And I can imagine that being very enticing for someone who doesn't have a lot of experience actually creating images like as a director, as someone who's thinking. But okay, if we sort of step back from that and go like, okay, well, maybe the future is artists being more directorial. Let's look at, what do directors actually do? The first thing they do is they often have a really freaking clear idea in their head of what this thing is going to be. And they have a very clear idea of how that's going to occur, in terms of, the cinematography, right? As a director, the sort of exact way that they're going to, light the scene, they're going to shoot it, where the actors are going to be, how the set is going to be created. And it's not something where you're kind of like messing around and doing a whole bunch of creative stuff. The power of a good director is that they have a really clear vision in their head. And this goes for video games and all these kind of creative things. The thing that will make the difference is that you do act like a director. You do have a clear picture in your head of what this thing is going to be. And often when you see video game projects fail and movies fail, it's because the person who was making a lot of decisions didn't really know what they wanted. They didn't have a clear picture. They didn't really trust what they had in their head. And so you get all of this editing, this kind of chopping and changing. And you see this with these movies where they're edited to the nth degree, and they're like, VFXing people and changing the whole scene. All this happens is because people don't actually know what the story they're telling is. They don't know what they're doing. Now figuring that out is immensely challenging. Becoming a good director is immensely challenging. I'm not saying I'm at that level, or I know how to do that, or that's easy. But if you kind of mess around and you don't have a really clear picture of how you're going to make this thing, then you're not really a director. You're just kind of messing around, right? And that's exactly the kind of approach you would see from a lot of directors who fail and don't become directors, or people who think they know how to make a video game, and they just don't really have a clear picture of what they're going to do. A lot of creative intent and making good things is about having a really clear picture as a director, as an auteur, of what you're trying to do. And yes, it's going to deviate. Yes, there's going to be a creative process. Yes, you're going to modify and change. And a lot of films are drastically modified in the edit. It's only when you have everything come together that you really figure it out. And you do have to reconstruct that original image with like the sound, the VFX, the pacing, the editing. All that's true. But if you don't have a really clear picture and you're not actually trying to achieve something very specific, you're not going to magically just kind of run into a good movie or something like that. So I think like, yes, that's true. But a lot of people who are saying like, oh, it's more like I'm a director. They're just not actually really acting like directors or understanding the clarity of vision that you would need to have. And for instance, most directors use storyboards or are really good at planning and proving a vertical slice of a game or a prototype, and just very quickly being like, this is what it is, guys. This is what we're making. We're going over here. let's go. I know where we're going. And again, that's the kind of visionary sort of leader and game designers that often create the really good games that everyone likes. The stuff where people don't have a clear vision, it often doesn't even get made, right? It just falls apart. And when it does, you kind of see often it's just chopped and mangled, and it's a wreck. And so again, the other thing you could say is that I think our real value as artists is as auteurs who are kind of actually coming up with our own unique things, right? There is this kind of mystique around because I grew up, and the first sort of real sort of course and education I had was in graphic design, and there was a lot of this mystique about, these really high-level maverick graphic designers who would do like logos, and these would be people where you get paid $1 million, in the 1980s or something like that to design a logo, right? And you'd have this story where the top person, right, the person whose name is at the creative ad agency or the design agency, right? These sort of real top level designers, and all they do is they just like waltz in there and they do a little sort of sketch of the logo, right, with a pen, and they just be like, right, that's it, my job's done. I'm going to collect my $1 million and I'll just have a bunch of peons actually kind of make that into real art. And it was the same for a lot of designers. A lot of good designers, and a lot of this ethos was like, I'm going to do a little sketch of how this sort of brochure would be, and I'll give it to a technical artist, a finished artist, and they'll just make it. And the value is in me being a director, me being able to understand what's going on. Yes, I think that does exist. A lot of the value is in the thumbnail, is in the sketch. That's why you need a thumbnail. That's why you need a sketch. And you won't be able to get there to that point where you are a director, where you are able to just do a little sketch and then send it off to a finished artist to make a finished logo and get paid some ungodly amount for it because you're just some big name. You won't get there unless you've worked in the trenches in general, unless you've been able to make it yourself and you understand the process. Good directors understand often the process for cinematography, script writing, story. They understand a lot of the moving parts, and they've often worked extensively at smaller scales, making the logos themselves, building the brochures, doing all that stuff on the ground level. And then they build up slowly to the point where now they're some big name and they can say, I know how to solve this problem with a little sketch. I'm just a director. And everyone else, all the AI, all the little peons, all the little finished artists, can just scurry around like ants and kind of make the real thing. And I'm just going to sit up here with my big idea. It's very hard to get there if you haven't worked in the trenches. So the last thing I'd say is, as I kind of touched on earlier, I've spent a lot of time trying to teach people how to draw. And more specifically, that one of the reasons I kind of started trying to build my own courses and do stuff on YouTube was because I often found that people would go through a lot of curriculums for entertainment design and they would really not truly understand who they were as an artist, and they sort of lost their own style. It's very easy to learn a lot of those foundations and fundamentals and kind of lose the uniqueness of your style. And I think a lot of our pursuits to become professional artists, they really do mean that you kind of lose a lot of your personality. And especially when you start relying on a lot of these crutches. Again, not always, because I think what we often see is we see really talented artists using a lot of these sort of 3D crutches and other ways of making imagery in the same way people use photographic sort of reference, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. You kind of see people do a really good job, but often it's based on the fact that they already worked in the trenches. They already understood how to make imagery. They'd already developed a lot of creative muscle, a lot of good thought processes. And it was always interesting early on in AI that the really good artists who were playing around with it made much better imagery than sort of all the AI bros and everyone else. It was always like, how's that even possible, But I think that's often what you're seeing. When you see people make really good work and they're relying on a lot of these kind of, I'm calling it a crutch, but it's just a tool, whatever it is. The reason it's good is often because they kind of understand how to do the work without it. And I think that's the most important thing to understand. And the more you can kind of build and develop your own process, your own creativity, to understand kind of what makes you tick and how to get the ideas you have in your head down onto the page in an effective, efficient, timely manner, and in a way that you can kind of share with other people, have the thumbnails, have a process. The more you can do that, I think the more you're going to actually be able to express yourself as an artist. So again, it's not to say any of these tools, maybe AI, who knows? I don't think so. I see no evidence of that, but maybe in the future it'll sort of become useful, but it's only going to become useful for people who actually understand how to sort of get those results without it. So it's either going to be like a time-saving tool or something like that, where it kind of is just creating everything. For me, the math is just not there. I just don't see any future in that actually creating any value or any use for artists. So like a lot of technology, I think the best thing to do is just completely forget about it. If it becomes really sort of useful later on, you'll be able to pick it up really, really easily. If we have AI assisted artistic tools in some way, like again, Photoshop actually becomes really good at like, helping you in some way, as opposed to just generating sort of art garbage, you'll just be able to pick that up. And the skills that you need to build are always those foundational creative skills. And this has been the case for like thousands of years, right? We always have tools, we always have technology, but you're only able to use them well when you kind of understand how to do the job without them, right? It's often that foundational stuff. It's understanding yourself. It's building your own creative processes that are going to actually make the difference. Anyway, that's all we got time for in this particular video. This is probably the most rambling, like least structured video I've made on this channel in a while. So again, I do apologize for that. If you're still here, if you're still listening, much appreciation. I'd be really keen to know what you think about these issues and whether this has kind of helped you to think through it in some way. Again, a lot of this is completely separate to the legal, the ethical, and the moral concerns around this, which I think are very sort of real and palpable. But again, the approach I'm trying to take, and again, let me know what you think of this, is, I'm much more interested in the practical side. Like, can it actually do what people are saying? And if so, like, is this good? Is this bad? That's kind of what is really sort of interesting to me. And also, the hype cycle sort of aspect of it. That's what's been the most interesting to me sort of over the years. So again, my goal here is to kind of test it out, like see whether it actually does any of this stuff. And as I said, from my experience, if you can actually do even a half decent job at what it's sort of trying to do, it might be able to save you some time, especially if you're interested in a really generic result. But in most cases, if I really think about it, if I just kind of sat down and wrote that, if I just actually kind of, did that thing, it's going to be more effective, more unique. I'm going to build my own skills. I'm going to build the right muscles. And, again, I think the marketplace is going to sort a lot of this stuff out. And that'll be really interesting to see over the next few years. So again, let me know what you think. I'm genuinely interested to hear where you sort of land. I would recommend kind of in general just to do more drawing, have more fun, and spend less time sort of worrying about, sort of YouTube drama. But so I do apologize for contributing to that. Anyway, other than that, catch you around. Happy drawing.